Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good day to everyone. I think we're probably going to get started, um, and hopefully more partners will be able to join as the hour progresses. Thank you for making the time to meet with us today. This is the second um, technical advisory group for the Disaster-FCV Nexus Thematic Area GFDRR from the past year. I think if you remember, we had a first one that shifted a little bit the strategic direction of the program. So this is the second one for us to update you on how we are doing. Um, so thanks a lot again for coming today. We'd like to walk you through briefly, very quickly, the agenda that we have prepared for today. Next slide, please, Lara. So we'd like to briefly, quickly, again, remind you of how the program has been shaping up over the past couple of years, update you on some of the activities that within the global team we've been doing, but also our teams in the different regions have been up to in the past couple of months. And then do a bit of a deep dive on one specific activity that we've been really hard at working at, which is the economic impact of disasters in conflict settings. And then open up the floor afterwards for a conversation with the TAG members. Really, the purpose of this meeting and the technical advisory group is really the advisory part of the meeting. And so we're going to try to make our presentation very short so that we open up the conversation afterwards. And then we're going to highlight some of the next steps for the rest of this fiscal year, which is a couple of months, and then next fiscal year. Particularly what we'd like to hear from you is if there are any specific topics that you'd like to see, if there are any specific countries that you'd like for us to present to you during the next TAG meeting, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Next slide. So just a very quick reminder of the bit of this strategic shift that we clarified the thematic area on a couple of years ago. If you remember at the beginning, it was really trying to focus on understanding the interplay between disasters and FCV Nexus, and then build on that to operationalize it. When we did our stock take a couple of months to see whether that has been successful or not, the unfortunate reality was that we were far from actually addressing the Nexus in a meaningful way. And we are actually struggling, even as a disaster risk management community, to first mainstream disaster risk management in countries that are fragile or that are conflict affected. And so that led us to rethink a little bit where our best action would be useful, which is looking from a corporate perspective and an operational perspective, how to support the countries in strengthening their investments in disaster risk management in these contexts, regardless of the situation on the ground, and rather advocate and show that there is evidence that a solid investment in disaster resilience and climate-related shocks resilience is actually beneficial to reducing potential side effects of fragility as well as conflict. And so that led us to our first pillar within the program, which is the mainstreaming DRM in FCV countries. The next evidence that we found is that there was a major lack in understanding what exactly it is that we mean when we talk about FCV sensitivity in DRM programming. And so that led us again to the next thing, which would be more of a qualitative support to the different task teams within the World Bank group that we are interacting with, to better reflect the contexts and the realities in the investments that we do in disaster risk management, as well as the analytics. And then finally, going back to the inception of this thematic area, really that crossover between disaster and FCV drivers, trying to better understand how we can act on those and address both disaster and fragility in doing our disaster risk management activities and analytics. So the way we do this, again, as pretty much everywhere we do everywhere in GFDRR, is through the strategic and operational level, as I mentioned. So we look at the strategic support to the country across the World Bank portfolio, and we try to inject disaster resilience support across the different World Bank engagement documents that govern our relationship with our government counterparts. And then at the operational level, once the design of the portfolio at the country level is done, what happens on the ground? We try also to catch some of the TTLs, the task team leaders, some of the countries that we work with, to try to help them think through about how to prioritize disaster resilience in conflict settings, in fragile settings, but also to do it in a way that does not worsen the situation at worst, but then at best do it in a way that brings together people around the same table. We're supporting also the global knowledge. We are a knowledge bank as well. As you probably know, we have a knowledge compact now with the new strategic direction of the bank. So this is part of what we are supporting the World Bank on this topic on. Enhancing technical competencies both within the bank as well as outside, and then finally strategic partnerships on the topic. Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, the objectives of this tag is really to walk you through some of the activities that we've been doing in FY24. To be honest, an hour is not enough. There's a lot of work that is being done. Again, just as a reminder, over 20% of GFDRR funding and activities go to FCV countries. And so there's a lot of different activities depending on the country that we choose. And they are not, we cannot generalize because it is truly specific to each one of the countries, the type of support that we're offering. So for example, the work that we are doing as the World Bank in DRC is probably very, very different from the work that we're doing in Timor-Leste or in Haiti at the moment. So the purpose again is to just walk you through very briefly some of the activities we're doing, and then do a quick deep dive on the analysis that we've been working on at the global team, and then have an in-depth discussion to really understand from your side what are some of the potential challenges that you'd like to see being talked about, or at least talked about, or better yet addressed, and then have a conversation as well with you about some of the expectations for the next technical advisory group meeting. Next slide, please. So next slide. So on the three pillars of engagement that we have, which are operational support, knowledge, as well as partnerships, I'll start with the operational support. So obviously, aside from the actual technical support directly to countries, to develop necessary institutional support documents, trainings and capacity building, depending on who we're engaging with, as well as the analytics for disasters, as well as conflict that are needed to prepare our operations across the different countries in FCV. I want to just highlight some of the flagship operational support that we did over the past couple of months. One being, honestly, the engagements post disasters. That's still something that we feel, as opposed to countries that do not have instances of fragility or conflict, post-disaster in analytics are really the ones that we feel there is a huge demand still for, particularly on grade. And so, as you know, this past couple of months, we had the Afghanistan Herat earthquake, we had the Yemen cyclone Tish, and then we had the floods in the DRC. And for all three, we have supported the development of a rapid damage assessment with a focus on fragility and the conflict dynamics and how they potentially could impact the recovery. These documents are incredibly informative for our country management units, but once they are published, they also are informative to understand programming from different actors on the ground. As we know, in Afghanistan and Yemen, a lot of the actors are international institutions, not so much the government. And so this information is very much taken, and we do see a lot of the use for it already. At the strategic level, if you recall, last year we started supporting the risk and resilience assessments, which are tools within the World Bank that are dedicated to FCV countries. And the idea behind that is to really give a snapshot of what the fragility situation in a country is ahead of the country partnership framework that decides what are the key priorities of the country. And oftentimes, some of the sectors that are the most critical and the most uh, that have the most potential to increase resilience to fragility are the ones that end up being prioritized as well in FCV countries. So that's a little bit how we try to provide, again, a level of evidence to how we prioritize the investments in our countries. Obviously, there's a lot of conversations with the ministries of finance and with the different sectoral ministries, but we try to be as impartial as possible and provide as much analytics as possible for that process. And so these RRAs are a critical piece to help decide where the next engagement with the countries that we work with is. And so what we have realized is that these resilience assessments are solely focused on political and social fragility, and they miss sometimes the picture on climate disasters, climate change and its impacts. And so what we offer to our FCV colleagues is to say, we will be able to provide you with the disaster analytics and have an overlay as well with some of the conflict dynamics and fragility dynamics in the countries. And so last year we did it successfully in Mauritania, and I'm really happy to share that analysis went into a budget support project that was developed by the World Bank, which had a CAD DDO option, where essentially hit the mark on the three elements that we highlighted in our analysis as the critical support areas to stabilize Mauritania even further and keep it as a peace haven in the Sahel region. And namely, that is land, civil protection, as well as flooding in the southern zones. So this year, we're trying to grow that, and we are supporting not one but three countries. These countries being Iraq, Timor-Leste, and Papua New Guinea. Unfortunately, these RRAs are internal documents. Some of them get published, but not all. But our analytics probably will be available for everyone, particularly at the PC membership level, where we can share our annexes with you based on demand. We also provided a lot of operational support team from GFDRR directly to countries in South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Comoros. And then there's a lot of other countries where the teams within the country level at the World Bank have been engaging with the country counterparts and actually advancing the Disaster-FCV Nexus agenda. Next slide, please. So when it comes to knowledge management, I want to highlight two papers we've been working on. One addresses the governance question in disaster risk management in fragile and conflict-affected settings, and it takes Lebanon as a case study following the explosion of the port of Beirut. We will be able to have it published within the next couple of weeks, so please stay tuned. And then another one is a guide to how to do World Bank operations and development operations when it comes to early warning systems in an FCV context. Oftentimes, what we noticed from doing a lot of hydromet work is that we focus a lot on the upstream, very much necessary, very critical institutional, technological level, but then sometimes we fail to address the last mile and creating that connections. And so often, and in FCV countries, we don't have that luxury, unfortunately. We do not have the luxury of spending a lot of time on the institutional support and the technological support, but we do have that prerogative to really help with the last mile early warning systems while still creating a sustainable path towards a value chain that is robust. And so this paper is really trying to address some of the learnings from different FCV countries that have attempted to establish early warning systems and learn a little bit what are the gaps, what are the challenges, and what can we do better. The idea forward in 2025 would be that we would have a decision tree that will help every team that tries to do early warnings or hydromet to prioritize what are the key questions that they need to add in the investments so that they have the best impact possible within the lifetime of their project. So when it comes to partnerships and networks and outreach, you've seen, I think, with many of you, we've engaged quite a lot. In the past, we've had activities around the Fragility Forum. We did a partnership day, a deep dive on this early warning systems question that I just mentioned. We participated in the European Humanitarian Forum, trying to push for an understanding that addressing fundamental disaster risk reduction in contexts of fragility is very important, and that we need to shift from the humanitarian support to more of a development agenda, despite the implementation challenges. We've also been very active with the donor community particularly on Somalia, and then obviously we are participating in the annual German Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. We've established an ongoing engagement with ACLED, which is the project for active conflict monitoring, to try to think a little bit about how we can refine our exposure models for disasters while taking into account exposure to conflicts. And then in the future, obviously, we have the Himeji Understanding Risk in June, where we hope to see most of you. We have a dedicated focus day following the Understanding Risk Conference days, where we're trying to go through the full disaster risk management activities that we do, from investments, analytics, sectoral mainstreaming. So how do we mainstream risk reduction in different sectors such as transport, housing, health, etc., within fragile and conflict-affected settings? What are the challenges and how we can overcome them? But we also have a technical session within the actual days of the Understanding Risk Conference that tackles the question on the economic impact of disasters in conflict settings, which I'll talk about later. Next slide, please. So now this is the study that I would like to have a deep dive on. The purpose of this study was that, coming from operational teams where I've worked personally in a lot of conflict-affected countries, whenever a disaster hits, we do not, or whenever even we do an assessment of the damages and estimations of recovery, we do not have the quantitative capacity to really understand how the disasters impact areas that are affected by conflict versus areas that are not affected by conflict. So the way we do our disaster analytics in a place like Tunisia or in a place like Colombia would be exactly the same as we would do them in a place like Chad or DRC or Papua New Guinea. And this is fundamentally flawed because we have these assumptions that we know that people living in a conflict-affected area, they will be far worse off than those who are not living in a conflict-affected area, but we don't know the delta. And for that, we do require an econometric methodology that will then be able to be applied to specific countries, depending on the need and depending on where we want to take the engagement forward. Is it prioritization of investments? Is it policy dialogue? Is it an institutional support or capacity building? So we designed this study to respond specifically to that. It has three parts. The first part is an econometric analysis of the impacts essentially of the econometric loss of that are incurred as a result of this disaster between a conflict and unaffected area. We take only historical examples. So we're not into modeling, we're actually looking at real life examples. So the way we do it is, and I'll get into the details of that. The second component is trying to qualitatively understand the how resilience some of the most critical sectors that we work with that get most damage after a major disaster can be amplified because of conflict situations. And then the third one is a modeling of how the welfare is actually impacted when we take into account the economic losses, we take into account the sectoral vulnerability, and then we take into account the actual conflict dynamics. So next slide. So for component one, we did two things. One is looking at the satellite imagery, nightlight satellite imagery between before and after cyclones Idai and Kenneth in Mozambique, and then before the floods in Nigeria back in 2022. And so what we try to do is to see if there is an actual differential impact between the nightlight satellite imagery, between the nightlight radiance in conflict areas versus non-conflict areas during the 6 months before and 6 months after. And lo and behold, yes, there is a significant difference between the recovery of nightlights during the first months after a disaster in a non-conflict affected area, where we see a higher prevalence of essentially light bulbs coming back online versus conflict affected areas where it takes a little bit longer. We supplemented that with household survey data on an analysis on income and household consumption expenditure using household surveys that we do at the bank with the poverty team. And understanding the impact of the over about 5 years in Nigeria specifically of how much people are actually losing in terms of income and in terms of their consumption capacity when they live in an area that is conflict affected that have been hit by a flood. And the difference is again stark, as you see in the graphs to your left. Just as a very rough number, for example, after a disaster, a conflict-affected household that is hit by a flood loses as much as 152% of their consumption capacity compared to a non-conflict affected household. This percentage is really very important for us to know so that we are able to model how their recovery time takes. And so this takes me to, if you don't mind, Katie, I'm just going to switch. Lara, if you could go to number 3 to the slide, the slide on there you go, stay here. So then this allowed us for the Nigeria case to model how long it'll take for people to recover from a disaster, and we compared the different states in Nigeria. So to your left again, we created a model based on the unbreakable model that was created by GFDRR a couple of years back, where we tried to see how long it'll take for these states, people in these states, to recover from a disaster. And the states in red, yellow, and green are conflict affected. Those in blue are not, or in a very low status. And the dynamic changes completely when we add a conflict indicator, the impact of conflict into this model. Using the same analysis that I just spoke with, that percentage, we plugged it in as the conflict indicator. So it recalibrated the model to show that actually states that are most conflict affected do have a much smaller recovery mean than what would have been projected by us, again using the same data, if we did not take into account the conflict indicators. And so the change, for example, is quite significant. I mean, it doesn't look like it's much, but for example, if I just take Borno, where it is 0.18 in terms of mean recovery rate, it drops to 0.06. And so that means that for every dollar that is lost by a household in Borno, what we thought would be that it would take them that they would have recovered 0.73 dollars over a period of over a certain period of time of 10 years. But the reality is that for every dollar that they lose, they only would recover about 0.03 rather than 73. So it's a very marginal, it looks very small, but when we expand it into an income, it becomes really significant for poor households. Next slide. The other thing that this study really showed us, that one, yes, thank you. The other thing that it really showed us is really the socioeconomic resilience. So mapping the socioeconomic resilience that includes not only the resilience to disasters, but also the resilience and the capacity to recover from disasters when taking into account the conflict dynamics. And we see that the maps completely change. We also learned something very important is that the new poor that are that emerge after a disaster over a certain period of time, either 1 year or 10 years, really change depending on where you are, if you take into account dynamics of movement and IDPs and conflict dynamics. And so it allows us to target a lot of our conversations with the governments based on these analytics that are a little bit more accurate than not. So that is the part 1 and part 3 of the study. I'll pass it on to Katie for part 2.
Thank you. So in complement to the econometric study and to try and provide some kind of explanatory value to those findings, we also conducted a qualitative assessment to try and understand how conflict impacts or undermines the resilience of critical sectors. So we looked very specifically at housing, health, and the transport sector, the reason being that they're the 3 sectors that have the biggest investments amongst the bank and also have the biggest and most significant impacts on the lives of those affected by conflict and disasters. Now, we found evidence from across all 3 of those sectors that FCV, obviously in very differentiated and context-specific ways, it does undermine sectoral resilience, and in turn, that increases disaster risk. Now, I need to stress that we found this for all components of all 3 sectoral value chains. If you take the case of Syria, we found, for example, that in the course of active armed conflict, there was a rapid acceleration of changes to land and planning regulations. And that meant that we saw urban planning really being weaponized and used to punish opponents. So that took the form of destruction of informal settlements, selective post-conflict reconstruction. So that's an example of where conditions of conflict have undermined sectoral functioning. But what we wanted to look at was then, in turn, what does that mean for disaster risk? And in turn, we found that the precarious housing conditions that many individuals found themselves in, that increased their exposure and vulnerability to not only seismic risk, but also hazards such as flood and drought. And we found similar things across the board. So take Yemen, for example. We have an example from the health sector where we know, and it's fairly obvious, I guess, that conflict has destroyed the physical infrastructure of the health sector, and that's also coupled with out-migration of healthcare workers. So again, we know that conflict undermines sectoral resilience. What we also found was that conflict-related displacement change patterns of service delivery demand, and those often and frequently go unmet. But in turn, if we make the link to disaster risk, we found that that undermined health system resilience actually increased the risk of health complications in the event of natural hazard-related disasters. So we found, for example, that the physical and mental health and well-being of individuals was lowered as a result of the conflict and the lack of access to those health services. And in turn, where you had disasters such as flooding, we saw an increase of waterborne diseases. So I guess the implication of this is just to make clear that certainly for policy and investment implications, there is a really clear need to make sure that disaster resilience is incorporated in all sectors, but that very specifically we have differentiated FCV sensitive disaster resilience that really takes account of the compounding impact of disasters and FCV.
Thank you, Katie. So this concludes the presentation part of our TAG meeting. And then we'd like to open the floor right now if you have any questions, any reactions, any requests for further explanation of what we have presented. We'd love to hear from you. And then get also your guidance as well on whether we are responding to some of the expectations from you. Great. If it's all clear, then maybe we can move to the next steps. Again, these are two questions that we have. One being what the next steps you envision for the Disaster-FCV Nexus. Are there any specific? Sorry, I see that someone has their hand up. Yes, please, Matthias.
Yes, thank you, Karim and Katie. No, that just to break the ice of one question. You have mentioned that you use this econometric analysis and qualitative analysis with, in your conversations with governments. I would be interested in that part a bit, if you could expand a bit more, to what extent then governments can use this data and are using this data to prioritize their DRR action in conflict affected areas. So to what extent this useful analysis is put to productive use, which is
so thanks, Matthias. That's a very good question. So for the case of Nigeria, the analysis has just been finalized. It is integrated in the DRM diagnostic of the country. So it's going to be the DRM diagnostic of the country is going to be adopted by the federal government. So that we are at that step. So we don't know whether then what we're hoping for is that this then will be able to allow the government to have conversations with the different states on how to prioritize their DRM engagements. And with the support of the World Bank, we're very active in the Borno and Northeastern region anyway. So we have an urban project and we have a DRM project. But now the idea with this national level DRM diagnostic that takes into account the conflict dynamics and has this unbreakable model attached to it is that we have a differentiated analysis that the government then is encouraged to use. Probably what we'll hear is within a couple of years that we'll hear really the true impact of this analysis, but not right now because the analysis is just finalized this FY. Now for a smaller scale, nothing as big as this and nothing as econometric as this, but just a co-location mapping that we did for Mauritania, that has been taken by the government very, very seriously, and it is we're seeing the results because of the reforms that have been passed this year. So, but that is not a risk reduction investment in the traditional sense. It was a reform level agenda where there was a reform of their preparedness and response law, and there was a reform of their land law based on the recommendations that we provided last year. So that is a concrete example that I am seeing already an impact, which is a reform level. Again, the reforms to a certain extent are a little faster than bigger investments in specific areas, especially that we work on the reforms quite a lot. So what we're hoping for in this analysis for Nigeria is that next year or the year after, we'll see an investment project in conflict affected areas that actually addresses the prioritization that we're recommending in our DRM diagnostic for the country. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Any other reactions, questions from the room? So, okay, so then if there are no questions, if we can move to the next steps, if we can get any guidance from the TAG membership on potential next steps that you might want to see for the thematic area, or recommendations for new partnerships that you'd like to see that we can work on. We always welcome expanding our networks, expanding our knowledge base. So please feel free to come in if at all relevant. Yes, Matthias?
Yes, no, in terms of partnership, I was wondering to what extent are you engaging in this, UNFCCC Paris Agreement COP process. They have this pact or this declaration they published last year, and there's a kind of a movement there. And I'm saying that as well because I think that in many aspects you're much further advanced than some of the climate finance providers that are reporting to those conventions, which for them conflict sensitivity is a relatively new concept. And I think they're struggling. I mean, if you look at the data on climate finance, climate adaptation, but also mitigation, conflict affected and fragile countries are much less, in relative terms, also per capita terms, much less considered. So there's a clear challenge there from those stakeholders to work, these climate finance stakeholders to work in this area, to have access, to work in a conflict sensitive manner. And I think you from the World Bank and GFDRR in particular, you have a lot of knowledge and insights. So just wondering to what extent do you also have, possible engagement with those, like the climate funds such as the GCF or the Adaptation Fund and others that are working in that space. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So when it comes to COP, we are in conversations all the time with the Secretariat. We commented on multiple rounds of the pact before it was published. But as you know, it was a big group of stakeholders spanning from the humanitarian actors all the way to peace building actors. So it was very difficult to actually come to a middle ground that does make sense. There seems to be a consensus across the board, however, that really what we mean by climate adaptation and the FCV Pact in FCV context, so climate adaptation in FCV context, is really what can be done within a time frame that is realistic and feasible for the governments that are going through fragility or going through a conflict episodes. And so that time frame and that span of attention is really falls within the disaster resilience. So the only thing that we really can do with FCV countries is looking at the impacts of acute climate shocks, which is disaster risk management. And so that we've in the follow-up after the COP28, we had a series of meetings with the GCF, with the Peace Building Fund, as well as with the COP28 Secretariat. There were some donors, including FCDO, the US, the Ireland, that tried to come together and come up with some sort of consensus of what the peace bill, what the FCV Pact really actually mean in practice. And we were part of that conversation, and we were trying to steer the discussion around the fact that, one, the reality is, to be honest, Matthias, is that the climate funds are only a drop in the bucket when it comes to the actual impact on climate adaptation. When we did at the World Bank, we did a cross-cutting analysis of all of adaptation financing that has been done. The biggest one remains IDA. That's the unfortunate reality, no? And the reason why IDA is the biggest one is because it is mainstream in climate adaptation across different sectors. So that vertical fund might be actually steering the conversation towards a not a very useful discussion around how to access the climate funds, rather than how do we mainstream climate in every development aspect. We tried also to guide the FCV Pact membership around the fact that when we talk about climate adaptation, it really depends on which context we're talking about. So, for example, in an area such as Comoros, where we are actively working right now, particularly since post-Cyclone Kenneth, that we cannot talk about climate-proofing infrastructure, because we need to first build the infrastructure and make it resilient. And so we need to make it resilient to the shocks that Comoros is having right now, which are the cyclones, which are the flooding, the landslides. So that's what we need to do. So it's much more about talking about development first, across the board, across all of the development partners, rather than focus on climate finance access, because that kind of skews a little bit the conversation towards what, in my opinion, is not necessarily the most productive way of doing it. So we're very much plugged in that conversation, but to a certain extent where we say, look, we need to look at the bigger picture, and we need to really be very, very specific about what we mean when we talk about climate adaptation in FCV contexts, because there's only so much one can do. There's only so much we collectively as development actors can do, and there's only so much the government can absorb and can pay attention to. And that is the unfortunate reality. So that is part of the conversation we've been having with the FCV Pact folks. We're also plugged in within our institution at GFDRR. We're part of the Climate FCV group as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Maybe just one follow-up question, if I may. I see there's not a lot of other colleagues anyway that on the call, so maybe I can ask a follow-up question. What about this Santiago network for loss and damage, which is also under those conventions? This is just being set up now. As you know, its main task is facilitating technical assistance to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And of course, DRR is a key aspect in that picture, especially for averting and minimizing. And I think this network will, I mean, its effectiveness and its relevance will depend crucially on important stakeholders like GFDRR, knowledge holders like GFDRR being part of this network. So the idea, that this network becomes like a clearinghouse for demand and supply of technical assistance in loss and damage. So certainly, if we talk about encouragements, I would encourage GFDRR to get in touch with the hosted secretariat that is being established. I think it's with UNDRR and UNOPS. So that's I think at least from the Swiss perspective, a promising initiative on the way, and it will greatly benefit if the World Bank and GFDRR get involved as well.
Absolutely. I actually was not aware that there was a network. I know that the fund is being hosted within the World Bank, but would be very happy to engage with UNDRR and UNOPS on this. I think the fund is still taking shape. They're not yet sure exactly what the governing structure is, but I think for its first phase at least, it'll be hosted. It will be hosted by the climate group within the World Bank. So we definitely are giving them all of the support they need when it comes to analytics, when it comes to triggers, because there's a lot of negotiations right now, at least to my understanding on the loss and damage, is that given that it is a loss and damage fund, a lot of the questions are from the governments is, do we get access to funding almost as on a contingent like a contingent line, rather than sort of investments into infrastructure to do risk reduction. And so that is a bit of a nuance in there that is still being negotiated to my knowledge. But the network seems to be really a good idea, and I think it will be very helpful to have that conversation. So if you could put us in touch with them, we would be very, very keen to have a conversation with them.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. Yeah, the network, the Santiago network, because I think was linked to the Santiago Cup. Is a parallel, I mean, yet linked initiative to the fund, and it has been established for good at the last COP28. It didn't get as much as attention as the fund, because the fund is kind of the big, also in financial terms, the big initiative there. But the Santiago network is certainly very useful, and is also supposed to work together with the fund. So I'm very happy to put you in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think, Matthias, if you don't have any other questions or reflections, maybe we could just close the meeting, given that I think everyone has already disconnected. So
Good. Yeah.
thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, that has been very informative, and keep up this good work.
Thank you. Thanks. We appreciate you sticking with us till the end.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye bye.